I just want to say hello to everyone, and first off, just thank Elder Mike for that lovely prayer. It's always good to start anything off, whether it's your day or a meeting in a good way. So, and that's always an honor. I'm actually coming to you from the traditional territory of the Kwanlin Dun First Nation and the Ta'an Quechan Council. So it's always my honor to do that. And for those that don't know, that's located in Whitehorse, Yukon. We are in the north. Dawson City, where I'm from, is about 500 kilometers north of here. And I am of the Trondikachin First Nation. So you did a good try at that, Simon. So I've had the pleasure of being on the FNEAA board with the team. Paulette has pulled together quite a team, and it's just a pleasure every time. I know we have lots of fun when we have our board meetings and that. And I've participated by listening and trying to recruit people to come and see some of the town halls, and they've flexed over the time period to what the needs are coming from the First Nations. So I was pleased to be asked about our organization and what we do, and tell you a little bit of a story of us. So I'm going to talk to you about something that it started many years ago, and we've resulted in making some significant movement in the past 5 years that in our picture, we're doing for Yukon First Nations education, our children, our education in our way. So for our story, what I want to bring understanding of, and this is just a little bit of the background of the Yukon First Nations Education Directorate, where we currently are and how that connection is to the importance of our way. And then framing our work with the 3 paths and 5 key areas that we work in. So I'm going to give you in a nutshell. I know what my time frame is, a little bit of a story of us, and then quickly, if I talk too fast or whatever, hopefully the questions I'll be able to answer afterwards. But Yukon has a little bit of a different story than a lot of the other regions in regards to Indigenous education, because of something that happened way back in 1960. It originally started, and that was when residential schools were being then deconstructed and taken, and jurisdiction being given back to First Nations. And although it did take 30 years to do that for some, when that happened, a lot of regions were acquiring back their jurisdiction within their respective First Nations, and then having to negotiate what that would look like. In Yukon, the federal government did something different in both of all 3 of the territories, and each of us have had a different path of changing that. But it was in 1964 when the federal government transferred responsibility for the education of status Indians to the territorial government. Instead of transferring it back to the respective First Nations, it was transferred through a master tuition agreement. And since then, the First Nations have had a very long journey with a multitude. And this is just a list of a few of the reports that have been studies, background, reforms, all these components of really saying, what is it that is for Indigenous education? Is it working? Is it not working? I was just saying alongside that, there was also in 1973, which is a very well-known document, Together Today for Our Children Tomorrow, that was delivered to the federal government from 12 of the Yukon First Nations, which was a statement of grievances on what was happening in contact with the Yukon, and they wanted change. And that document actually led the umbrella final agreement and 11 of our 14 First Nations into a self-governing agreement process. Since then, there's been a myriad of resources, of studies, of papers done on education. And the interesting piece on that was that the 1973 Together Today for Our Children Tomorrow document, 2/3 of it spoke to education and the First Nations dissatisfaction of what was happening. And they actually had mapped out a pretty clear path of what they wanted to see. Fast forward now to 2009, when an Auditor General's report came, really damning Yukon education with not doing an effective job for First Nations education in Yukon. The achievement results were deplorable, and that pressed leadership to really, at the political level, press the government to bring some change. And they entered into a tripartite agreement, which is known as, lovingly to me, the JEEP. It was a 10-year agreement to look at the 4 pillars that the First Nations had driven and designed. That 10-year agreement actually started in 2014. The First Nations spent some time developing it, what their priorities were, with 4 pillars that were culture and language, authority, control and responsibility, sustainability, supports and success, and then closing the academic achievement gap. A new government comes in, and by 2016, they were not seeing anything being done with the JEEP, and there was some frustration. So the chiefs actually pulled together again and said, all right, we did what you said you were going to do, and it's not working. And so they went back within themselves, where all 14 First Nations came together and said, what would it be if we had our own system? What would that look like? And so a 2-year process was then enacted, where all 14 First Nations came together, and we pulled in some successful regions that had implemented their own systems. Mi'kmaq, Kinamatway, the Anishinaabe in northern, the Anishinaabe Cree, and then the First Nations Education Steering Committee. And then there was also one area in the Yukon that was showing success, and it was the CSFY, which was the Francophone Association, who had their own, they were the only school board in the Yukon. At the end of those 2 years in that consultation, there was, the CCOE was the final end. There was 2 pieces to it. One was to, in the final visioning session, to reestablish the Yukon Chiefs Committee on Education, which was done in May of 2018. And then they immediately passed 2 resolutions. And those 2 resolutions, one was to support what was known as the draft framework agreement. That framework agreement was one of 7 options that the leaderships were given to move forth with advancing for local control of First Nations education. And they selected it because of the 2-phase process. The second resolution that they passed was to establish this organization. And that was some great insight from the leadership of the day, and it continues on, and I'll speak a little bit to that later. The framework agreement process really, the reason it was selected was there was a number of factors that they had considered. One was that time was the number 1 factor. It was utilizing existing legislation, and it would form a collaborative relationship. Now, there were some that liked it and some that didn't like it. With the passing of the resolution, there were 2 folks immediately. One was myself and the other is Darren Lease, that were appointed as CCOE technicians. And so we had to come up with a lot of here's the backgrounds of the why and the what, and the how. And in drafting the framework, why it was selected was the time that we would be able to do to get it done and implemented. It utilized existing legislation, and it also provided the First Nations with options. They did not necessarily have to be in the first phase of the option. They could be in the second phase. The first phase was to negotiate a First Nations school board. The second being that down the road, if they wanted to move to a regional education agreement. A few of the First Nations have hopped over and are already in that process with their technical table negotiating a regional education agreement. The foresight of the chiefs to put this organization in play for that was that one of the things that they had seen previously was there was no formal body that was actively doing the work to negotiate the agreements, to make the changes for the Indigenous students in the territory, because that master tuition agreement meant that we had no schools that were on reserve, one, because there's no reserves in the Yukon. And all of the schools in Yukon are ministry operated schools. So that's a different platform that you have to navigate. So they had no formal organization that was, doing that work of holding that big thing called government accountable. So establishing this organization was a very key move. They gave us 5 key areas right off the bat of what we would have to take as our build our key tasks under. And those 5 key areas are accountability, support and capacity, research, programs and initiatives, and then the continued negotiation of the framework agreement. So formally, this organization actually established as a nonprofit in December of 2019. Our board of directors is actually the Chiefs Committee on Education. We have been working over the past year, and I have to note that we actually navigated through this during a pandemic. So it's a marvel that in itself, we've managed to navigate through it and get things going. We've over the past year and a half been operationalizing, getting our staffing, continuing that work of negotiating the framework agreement, and then continuing on with the work that has to be implemented. Working with the ministry operated schools means that we have Indigenous students in 29 schools in the Yukon that we have to ensure, and that accountability piece with the ministry, that they are doing their best efforts with our students and there is appropriate programming happening for them. So we look like this on an organizational chart. Our board of directors, as I said, is the CCOE. I have the pleasure of being the executive director, and I, on a daily basis, say that I have the team that is a dream team. It's just my honor to be working with them on a daily basis. So what are those 3 paths? And every day, all the work that I do, all the work that my team does, they know they have to think of this way and our mandate really is, we serve the Indigenous students. What's the work that we're doing? And I'm constantly bringing everybody back to that. I don't care about politicians, and sometimes the chiefs don't like it when I say it to them as well. It's not about you. For me, it's about the children and the students and how we serve them. So those 3 paths that we have is the current existing status quo. There are all of the schools were, and I'm going to say were now, fully ministry operated schools. How do we support the students in there so that there's going to be success? And the second is the First Nations School Board Agreement. As of a month ago, it was actually a few months ago, in February of 2021, we signed the agreement with the Minister of Education. The Chiefs Committee on Education did that. The First Nations School Board Agreement we had drafted was a go-ahead. We then had to do a referendum process. That referendum process was run in January of 2022, and we successfully have 8 schools under the newly formed First Nations School Board Agreement, and we're now working towards the implementation of that for the startup of the 22-23 school year. And then the third path is the Regional Education Agreement. Those regions right now that want their own school, it's their own jurisdiction. How does that look for this organization to be serving that? And I really do have to give the chiefs the credence that they had the forethought. It was many years of things not working and trying to navigate that they said, no, if we're going to go down this path, we need to have an entity that's going to be able to, one of them always says that they have to be able to take the football and work it in how it's going to work best for our students. So that looks like a couple of things for me. We have the technical relationships that I have to navigate on a daily basis. And those technical relationships are really about what's actually boots on the ground and happening in the schools. YFNED, our board of directors, we take direct direction from the Chiefs Committee on Education. We also are the administrator, but hold no vote for the First Nations Education Commission. Excuse me. And that First Nations Education Commission is who holds the Joint Education Action Plan. So they have representation from all 14 First Nations. Not all 14 First Nations are signed on to the school board agreement. Only 10 of them are. So we still have to administer the work that they put out in the Joint Education Action Plan to the K-12 schools, whether they're in ministry operated or a First Nation school board or run by one of the First Nations. And then there's another loving piece that I have, which is the political piece. And this really falls on my deck more than the folks on my team, but it's being able to navigate that so that I can ensure my team has the tools to do the work that we do on a daily basis for the Indigenous students. And that is also, you know, with Yukon government, the government of Canada, and in the territories, we do have a little bit of a different dynamic with CERNAC, because not only do we have to work with ISK, we have to work with CERNAC as well. So it creates some different dynamics there. One of the things we did in the establishment was a relationship with Jordan's Principle and looking at what it is we could do to serve our at-risk children. And we developed a wraparound prevention service model. And that wraparound prevention service model very much puts the child in the center. And we have basic components in there of what does it take to have a child go from cradle to community member. And we think of that in those three paths all the time. The spokes in those wheels or the cogs that build that model is our First Nations Education Advocates is one, where we have a team of about 20 advocates that work in the different schools. And they're there to ensure that the students have a sense of belonging, they have an understanding, they help with the teachers bringing understanding of those cultural needs for students in the schools. And the advocacy. So when the child doesn't have a voice, they are that voice. We have an early years program that is operated in 5 communities and the urban area here. It's a partnership with the Martin Family Initiative, where 0 to 5, we focus with the families in a culturally based model to make sure that they're school ready when they get to school. The other piece was always having food. So we operate an urban and a rural nutritional service program. This is where we negotiated that the funding actually directly goes to the First Nations, and we hold a service coordination position that helps with ensuring that every Indigenous child has 2 healthy meals a day. And that is one of the programs that it was a significant marker that made a difference, especially in the communities where food equity and food security for a lot of the northern communities is a very, very touchy item, and it's a challenge for them. There's not just the ability of access of getting foods. I know Cheryl is on, she is in our one rural community that is the only fly-in. So it made a big difference because the rationale behind this was if you're not well fed and you're hungry, you can't learn. So we need to ensure that for our children on a daily basis. We also did an environmental scan, and that brought in our mobile therapeutic unit, especially. It's very focused on the rurals. The mobile therapeutic unit provides our Indigenous children with occupational therapy, speech and language, mental wellness, vision, and audiology. The rationale behind that was, again, with the environmental scan, we saw a huge gap where those services were not making it to the rural areas. And we put that in so that we could ensure that. So I have a team that goes out of OTs, PTs, SLPs, and they provide those services. I can say right now, the one that is probably the most taxed is the mental wellness team. And all of that is done from an Indigenous lens. So it looks very different. This isn't about booking an hour with a counselor all the time. This is about looking what mental wellness is from an Indigenous lens and ensuring that that is implemented. Sometimes it's done in a community-based model. Sometimes it's done in a small group model. Sometimes it's done in a classroom. And sometimes it is done on an individual level. So it just depends on what the need is. And they have to flex and change probably more than anyone else on the team. And then the one component on it was that transportation was very key. There was a huge barrier that was happening across in regards to the transportation model for access to education in a number of communities and in the urban area. So we've done very well in providing, but it is the one weak area that we know, access and getting our kids to the schools. And now with COVID, the challenges that we've had of disengagement, it's become a very big priority. So it really looks like this on a daily basis. There you go. That's actually one of my favorite slides with the advocates doing a lot of the work. It's about bringing those culturally based learning activities to the classroom, to the educators, helping them understand our ways of doing things and being respectful of it without expropriating it. Connecting the kids to their culture, awakening them with their language. Those are all the components that we have to work with on a daily basis and in those three paths.